My family told everyone I was a failure. I sat quietly at my brother's rehearsal dinner. Then his fiancée looked at me and whispered, "Wait, you're Director Thompson." The entire table fell silent. Even my father, who had spent years calling me his greatest disappointment, couldn't find words. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The ivory wedding invitation felt heavier than it should have in my hands. Marcus Williams and Isabella Chen request the honor of your presence. The elegant script seemed to mock me, each letter a reminder of how far behind I'd fallen in the family race. My younger brother Marcus, the golden child, was finally getting married, and I, David Williams, the 35-year-old family embarrassment, was expected to show up and smile through another celebration of everything I wasn't. Sitting in my modest apartment in Quantico, Virginia, I stared at the invitation while the familiar weight of inadequacy settled on my chest like a lead blanket. 15 years. 15 years since I'd walked away from law school at Georgetown, and the brand of failure still burned fresh in my memory. I could still recall that humid September day when I'd stood in my father's corner office at Williams & Associates, the prestigious law firm he'd built from nothing. The mahogany walls lined with legal tomes and framed diplomas seemed to close in around me as I struggled to find the words. "I can't do this anymore, Dad. Law school isn't for me." Harold Williams, respected attorney and pillar of the Washington, D.C. legal community, had simply stared at me across his imposing desk. No explosion, no shouting, just a cold, devastating silence that lasted an eternity. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, clinical. "You're throwing away everything we've worked for, David, everything we've sacrificed to give you." The disappointment in his eyes that day had been more crushing than any anger could have been. My mother, Patricia Williams, had taken a different approach. She'd cried for days. The sound of her muffled sobs echoing from their bedroom had been unbearable. At dinner parties, I'd overheard her explaining to friends in hushed, mortified tones how her eldest son had lost his way and was going through a difficult phase. While I was lost, Marcus was ascending. Fresh out of Harvard Law, he'd seamlessly slipped into the family firm, charming clients and winning cases with the kind of natural charisma that made headlines. The local legal journal had featured him on their cover, "Rising Star, the Next Generation of Williams' Legacy." The article had been framed and hung in the office lobby, a daily reminder of what success looked like in the Williams family. Family gatherings became showcases for Marcus's achievement. I remember one particularly painful Thanksgiving when Dad had stood up, wine glass in hand, to toast Marcus's promotion to junior partner. "To my son," he'd declared, his voice booming with pride, "who understands the value of dedication and following through on commitment." The unspoken comparison hung in the air like smoke. I'd tried to explain my decision to join the FBI Academy, but my words had fallen on deaf ears. Federal law enforcement. Dad had scoffed. "David, you could have been arguing cases before the Supreme Court. Instead, you want to be a glorified security guard?" The truth was, I'd found my calling in those first few months at Quantico. The rigorous training, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that every day brought the possibility of protecting innocent people. It ignited something in me that studying corporate law never had. But try explaining that to a family that measured success solely in billable hours and courtroom victories. My early years with the Bureau were a blur of field offices in forgotten corners of America. Des Moines, Albuquerque, Little Rock, each assignment took me further from the Washington elite circles my family inhabited. I worked bank robberies, organized crime cases, and public corruption investigations. Each solved case, each criminal brought to justice, felt like a small victory against the chaos of the world. But to my family, I was simply David, the son who'd chosen a government job over real success. The isolation was crushing. Phone calls home became increasingly rare. Each conversation a painful reminder of how little they understood or cared about my work. When I'd try to share stories about cases I'd worked, about lives I'd helped save, their responses were polite but distant. "That's nice, dear," Mom would say, before inevitably steering the conversation back to Marcus's latest courtroom triumph or his new corner office with the view of the Capitol. Marcus never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. "Still playing cops and robbers, Dave?" He'd joke during the rare times we were in the same room. "When are you going to get serious about your career?" He'd say it with a smile, but the condescension was unmistakable. I threw myself into my work with the desperation of a man trying to prove something to himself, if not to others. I worked weekends, holidays, and took on the cases other agents didn't want. My superiors began to notice. Commendations started appearing in my file. I was selected for specialized training programs, assigned to high-profile task forces, but I kept these victories to myself, tired of watching my family's eyes glaze over when I tried to share them. The turning point came during a domestic terrorism investigation in Chicago. I'd been working undercover for months, infiltrating a group planning to bomb a federal building. The case was complex, dangerous, and ultimately successful. We prevented the attack, saving potentially hundreds of lives. The director himself had called to congratulate me, but when I'd mentioned it to my parents during our monthly phone call, Dad had simply said, "Well, David, I hope you're being careful. Marcus just landed the Henderson account, you know, the pharmaceutical company. It's worth millions to the firm." That night, alone in my hotel room, I'd made a decision. I stopped trying to earn their approval. I stopped sharing my victories, my promotions, my growing reputation within the bureau. If they wanted to see me as a failure, so be it. I had work to do. The years passed in a blur of investigations, arrests, and quiet satisfaction. I specialized in white-collar crime, public corruption, cases that required patience, intelligence, and an understanding of how power worked in America. My clearance level rose. My responsibilities expanded. I was assigned to joint task forces with other agencies, briefed senators on national security matters, worked cases that would never see the light of day in newspaper headlines. But to my family, I remained David the disappointment. At Marcus's law school graduation party, I'd overheard Dad explaining to a colleague that I worked for some government agency or another. Nothing too important, you understand. The dismissal had stung, but by then I'd developed a thick skin. Now, staring at Marcus's wedding invitation, I felt that familiar knot of dread forming in my stomach. Another family event, another opportunity to be reminded of my failure. The rehearsal dinner would be held at the Hay Adams Hotel, the kind of place where Washington's elite gathered to see and be seen. I'd be expected to play my role, the quiet older brother who'd never quite lived up to his potential. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror of my small apartment. The face staring back showed the effects of years of stress, of carrying secrets, of bearing the weight of responsibilities I could never explain. My parents saw a man who'd thrown away his potential. They had no idea that the quiet, unremarkable son they'd written off was living a life more consequential than they could possibly imagine. The next morning, I received a call from my assistant director. "David, we need to discuss your security details for the wedding. Given your position," I'd cut him off. My family didn't know about my position. They didn't know about anything. And I preferred it that way. Or so I thought. Until I walked into that rehearsal dinner and everything changed forever. The Hay Adams Hotel lobby sparkled with the kind of understated elegance that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors where Washington's power brokers had walked for decades. As I handed my keys to the valet, I caught a glimpse of myself in the polished brass elevator doors. Charcoal suit, conservative tie, the uniform of respectability that never quite felt like it belonged to me. The private dining room buzzed with conversation when I arrived. 20 carefully selected guests, each representing a different facet of Marcus and Isabella's interconnected worlds of law, politics, and old money. I recognized several faces from the society pages. Senators, federal judges, the kind of people who shaped policy over cocktails and handshake agreements. Marcus stood near the bar, resplendent in a custom-tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. At 28, he possessed the kind of effortless confidence that opened doors before he even knocked. His laugh carried across the room as he regaled a small circle with what was undoubtedly another story of his courtroom brilliance. "David?" Mom's voice cut through the ambient chat. Patricia Williams glided toward me, elegant in navy silk, her smile bright but strained around the edges. "You made it. We weren't sure." She let the sentence hang, a gentle reminder that my attendance at family events had become increasingly sporadic over the year. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, accepting her brief hug. She smelled of Chanel No. 5, the same perfume she'd worn for as long as I could remember, a scent that now triggered a Pavlovian response of anxiety in family settings. Dad materialized beside her, his handshake firm but perfunctory. Harold Williams at 62 still commanded attention when he entered a room, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of a man accustomed to deference. "Son," he acknowledged with a nod. "Good to see you could get away from whatever it is you're doing these days." The dismissal was casual, practiced, delivered without malice, but with the kind of indifference that somehow hurt worse than outright hostility. In his mind, I worked some mid-level government positions, shuffling papers and collecting a modest paycheck. The reality, that I held one of the most sensitive positions in federal law enforcement, was a truth I'd long since stopped trying to share. "Isabella, darling, come meet David." Mom's voice carried that slightly forced brightness she used when managing potentially awkward social situations. Marcus's older brother. Isabella Chen turned from her conversation with what appeared to be a federal appeals court judge, and I felt my breath catch slightly. She was beautiful, certainly, with the kind of classical features that looked elegant in wedding photos, but it was her eyes that struck me, intelligent, assessing, missing nothing. There was a sharpness there that suggested depth beyond the society page surface. "David," finally. Her handshake was firm, her smile genuine. "Marcus talks about you all the time." I glanced at my brother, wondering what version of me existed in Isabella's mind. Knowing Marcus, probably a sanitized tale of an older brother who'd lost his way, but was harmless enough to warrant occasional pity. "All good things, I hope," I managed, the social pleasantries feeling foreign after years of interrogation rooms and classified briefings. "He says you work for the government, law enforcement." There was something in her tone, a precision that made me look at her more carefully. Most people, when they heard government work, immediately lost interest. Isabella seemed genuinely curious. "A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel." Now, back to where we left off. "FBI," I confirmed, keeping my response deliberately vague. "Field work, mostly." "How fascinating. What kind of cases?" Before I could answer, Dad's voice boomed across our small circle. "David's our resident G-man," he announced with the kind of hearty laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Chasing down tax evaders and bank robbers, isn't that right, son?" The reduction of my career to something from a 1950s radio drama was typical Harold Williams. Take something he didn't understand, minimize it, file it away under not important enough to care about. I'd stopped correcting these characterizations years ago. "Something like that," I said quietly. Isabella's eyes narrowed slightly, a micro-expression that lasted barely a second, but suggested she'd caught something in the exchange that others had missed. "Tax evaders and bank robbers," she repeated thoughtfully. "That must keep you busy." David's always been drawn to unconventional paths. Mom interjected smoothly, her smile tight. "We're just grateful he found something that makes him happy, even if it's not quite what we'd envisioned." The conversation moved on, carried by the social momentum of a room full of accomplished people, discussing accomplished things. I found myself relegated to the periphery, occasionally pulled into discussions about current events where my contributions were received with polite disinterest. When someone mentioned a recent high-profile corruption case that had dominated headlines, I bit my tongue rather than reveal I'd been intimately involved in the investigation. Marcus held court effortlessly, discussing a recent Supreme Court decision with the kind of casual expertise that reminded everyone why he was the family's bright star. The implications for corporate liability are staggering, he was saying, gesturing with his wine glass. We're already seeing clients restructure their entire compliance frameworks. Marcus has such a brilliant legal mind, gushed Senator Harrison's wife, a woman whose husband sat on the Judiciary Committee. You must be so proud of both your sons, Harold. Dad's chest swelled with visible pride. Marcus is carrying on the family tradition beautifully. Partner track at 28, youngest in the firm's history. Of course, his brother chose a different path. The sentence trailed off with the kind of diplomatic ellipsis that spoke volumes. I excused myself and stepped onto the hotel's terrace, where the lights of Washington stretched out below like a constellation of power and ambition. The White House was visible in the distance, a reminder of the city's perpetual dance of influence and authority. How many times had I briefed officials in that building? How many national security decisions had crossed my desk? Yet here, among my own family, I remained the son who'd chosen wrong. Escaping the crowd, I turned to find Isabella beside me, her evening wrap draped elegantly over her shoulders against the October chill. Just getting some air, I said. Big gatherings aren't really my thing. She studied me with those perceptive eyes. You know, I did some research after Marcus first mentioned you. David Williams. FBI. There are quite a few David Williams in the bureau. Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. I imagine there are. Funny thing though, when I searched for David Williams in connection with some of the major federal cases of the last few years, financial crimes, public corruption, organized crime, the same name kept appearing in the background. Never in the headlines, mind you, always in the footnotes, the acknowledgments, the classified portions of congressional testimony. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. That's interesting. David Williams was mentioned in connection with the Senator Morrison corruption case. David Williams was listed as a key investigator in the offshore banking scandal that brought down 3 congressmen. David Williams briefed the Senate Intelligence Committee on the pharmaceutical company price-fixing investigation. She paused, letting the implications hang in the air. Quite a coincidence, all these David Williams. I said nothing, but I could feel her watching me, parsing my reaction with the precision of someone accustomed to reading between lines. And then there's the really interesting part, she continued quietly. I have a friend who works in the Attorney General's office. Just this morning, she mentioned something curious. Apparently, FBI Director David Williams was scheduled to have his security detail review all social engagements for the next month. She turned to face me fully. Now, why would an FBI field agent need a security detail? The question hung between us like a bridge. I could either cross or burn. For years I'd maintained the fiction of my insignificance, let my family's assumptions shield the truth of what I'd become. But standing there, looking into Isabella's intelligent eyes, I realized someone had finally bothered to look beyond the surface. You tell me, I said softly. She smiled then, an expression of dawning understanding mixed with something that might have been respect. Oh my God, she whispered. You're not just any David Williams, are you? Before I could respond, Marcus's voice carried from inside, calling for everyone to take their seats for dinner. The moment shattered, replaced by the immediate need to return to our designated roles, the successful lawyer and his quietly disappointing older brother. But as we walked back into the dining room, I caught Isabella stealing glances at me, her entire perception visibly shifting. The unremarkable government worker was disappearing, replaced by something far more complex and significant. I had no idea that in less than 24 hours, she would accidentally detonate the carefully constructed fiction of my failure in front of the entire family. The wedding reception at the Kennedy Center's rooftop terrace was everything Isabella had dreamed of. Sweeping views of the Potomac, string quartet playing softly in the corner, and Washington's elite mingling beneath twinkling lights, strung between marble columns. I stood near the edge of the crowd, nursing a glass of champagne and watching my brother work the room with the effortless charm that had always come so naturally to him. The ceremony itself had been beautiful, held in the center's concert hall with its soaring ceiling and perfect acoustics. I'd watched Marcus pledge his love to Isabella, noting how radiant she looked in her vintage Vera Wang gown, but throughout the service I'd caught her stealing glances in my direction, her expression thoughtful, as if she were solving a puzzle piece by piece. "David, there you are." Mom appeared at my elbow, slightly breathless from navigating the crowd in her heels. "Senator Mitchell's wife wants to meet you. She's fascinated by law enforcement work." I suppressed a sigh. These introductions were always the same, well-meaning socialites who watched too much television and expected me to regale them with stories of car chases and shootouts. The reality of my work, endless briefings, budget meetings, congressional testimonies, and the weight of decisions that affected national security, wasn't exactly cocktail party material. "Perhaps later, Mom. I think Isabella might need some air." It wasn't entirely true, but I'd noticed. Isabella deep in conversation with a group that included Attorney General Richardson's chief of staff, and something about her body language suggested she was probing for information. Again, the reception dinner featured all the hallmarks of a Williams family celebration. Prime rib carved tableside, champagne from Dad's personal collection, and toast after toast celebrating Marcus's achievements. I found myself seated between Mom's oldest friend, Miss Pemberton, and Isabella's college roommate, both of whom seemed determined to extract my life story between courses. "So David," Mrs. Pemberton leaned in conspiratorially, her voice carrying the slight slur of someone who'd enjoyed the cocktail hour thoroughly, "your mother tells me you work for the FBI. How exciting. Do you carry a gun?" "Sometimes," I answered truthfully, though the reality was more complex. The Glock 19 in my jacket wasn't standard issue. It was the sidearm assigned to someone whose daily briefings included threat assessments and security protocols most people couldn't imagine. "Have you ever shot anyone?" Isabella's college friend asked with the breathless fascination of someone whose closest encounter with violence was watching crime dramas. "I hope I never have to," I replied, which was both diplomatic and honest. Dad stood to give his toast, his commanding presence immediately drawing the room's attention. He spoke eloquently about family legacy, about Marcus carrying forward the Williams name with distinction, about Isabella being the perfect addition to their accomplished lineage. He managed to acknowledge my presence without actually saying anything meaningful about me, a masterful display of diplomatic omission. "To Marcus and Isabella," he concluded, raising his glass, "may your future be as bright as your talents deserve." The applause was warm, genuine. Marcus beamed, his arm around Isabella's shoulders. She smiled graciously, but I noticed her eyes scanning the room, landing on me with that same analytical intensity I'd observed the night before. As dessert was served, Isabella excused herself from the head table and made her way through the crowd. I assumed she was working the room, thanking guests for attending, playing the perfect bride. Instead, she stopped at my table. "David, could I borrow you for a moment? I'd love to introduce you to someone." Mrs. Pemberton tittered excitedly. "Oh, how lovely. The bride wants to show off her new brother-in-law." I followed Isabella through the crowd toward a small group near the terrace railing. As we approached, I recognized several faces: a federal appeals court judge, the deputy attorney general, and Director Coleman from the CIA. My stomach tightened as I realized where this was heading. "David, I'd like you to meet Judge Harrison," Isabella began, her voice carrying clearly despite the ambient noise. "Judge Harrison, this is David Williams, Marcus's brother." Judge Harrison, a distinguished African-American woman in her 50s, extended her hand with a polite smile. "Pleasure to meet you, David. What line of work are you in?" Before I could answer, Isabella continued with seemingly innocent enthusiasm. "David works for the FBI. He's been involved in some fascinating cases: public corruption, organized crime, financial fraud." "How interesting," the Deputy Attorney General chimed in. "What field office?" The conversation was spiraling beyond my control. I could feel other nearby guests tuning in, including my parents, who had drifted over with their social radar activated by the mention of prestigious titles. I work out of headquarters mostly, I said carefully. Headquarters? Director Coleman raised an eyebrow. What division? Isabella's eyes were bright with barely contained excitement. Oh, David's being modest. He's not just any agent. She turned to face the growing circle of listeners, her voice gaining volume and clarity. David, don't you think it's time your family knew exactly what you do? The moment stretched like a taut wire. I could see my parents approaching. Dad's expression shifting from social curiosity to something approaching alarm, as he recognized the high-level officials surrounding his supposedly unremarkable son. Isabella, I said quietly. Perhaps this isn't the time. Wait a minute, Judge Harrison interrupted, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face more carefully. David Williams, FBI headquarters. Her expression shifted dramatically. My God, you're not David Williams, the agent. You're Director Williams. The words hit the crowd like a physical force. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet continued playing, but their music seemed to fade into the background as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. Director, Dad's voice cracked slightly on the word. He stood frozen 3 feet away, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. Mom's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his face flushed. What's going on here? Director of what? Director Coleman stepped forward, his expression grave. Marcus, your brother is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He's been in position for 18 months. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, apparently sensing the shift in the room's energy. 200 of Washington's most powerful people stood frozen, watching a family implode in real time. That's impossible, Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. David works. He's just an agent. He investigates tax fraud. Judge Harrison's laugh was short and sharp. Harold, your son runs an organization with 35,000 employees. He briefs the president weekly. He testified before my committee just last month about counter-terrorism strategies. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth, her excitement transforming into horror as she realized what she'd just unleashed. Oh God, David, I thought they knew. I thought they were just being modest about family business. You didn't know? Director Coleman's voice carried a note of incredulity that made the situation even more surreal. Harold, your son is one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. His security clearance is higher than most cabinet members. Mom made a small, wounded sound, her face pale as she stared at me as if seeing a stranger. David, is this true? The weight of 15 years of carefully maintained fiction pressed down on me. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for my response. 200 pairs of eyes, including those of my family, fixed on me with expressions ranging from shock to fascination to something approaching awe. I looked at my father, this man who had spent years dismissing my choices, who had introduced me to colleagues as his son, who worked for some government agency. I saw the exact moment when the full implications hit him, every casual dismissal, every condescending comment, every time he'd relegated me to the children's table of family significance. Yes, I said simply. It's true. The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Dad swayed slightly, his face draining of color. Marcus stared at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if I'd revealed myself to be an alien species. Mom burst into tears. Not the delicate, social tears she was known for, but ugly, genuine sobs of shock and confusion. In the space of 30 seconds, 15 years of family dynamics had been obliterated, leaving nothing but the smoking crater of their shattered assumptions about who I was and what I'd become. The Kennedy Center's rooftop terrace had transformed from a celebration into something resembling a crime scene. Guests clustered in small groups, their voices hushed as they processed what they'd just witnessed. The Williams family meltdown had become the evening's entertainment, though no one seemed quite sure how to react to watching one of Washington's most prominent legal families discover they'd been living with the FBI director for 15 years, without knowing it. I stood at the center of the chaos, watching my family struggle to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the reality that had just been thrust upon them. Dad remained frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Mom had stopped crying but stood trembling, clutching her purse with white knuckles as if it were a life preserver. Marcus was the first to find his voice. "This is insane," he said, his usual confidence cracking. "David, you can't be the FBI director." I would have known. We would have known. How? I asked quietly. When was the last time any of you asked about my work? Really asked. Not just made assumptions. Director Coleman, perhaps recognizing the need for damage control at such a public venue, stepped forward diplomatically. Perhaps we should allow the family some privacy to process this. He nodded toward me with the kind of deference I'd grown accustomed to, but had never seen directed at me in front of my family. "Director Williams, I'll make sure your security detail coordinates with the venue's arrangements." Security detail. The words hung in the air like another bombshell. I could see my parents processing this additional layer of unreality. Their supposed failure of a son required Secret Service-level protection. Isabella, her wedding dress now seeming almost absurd against the gravity of what she'd unleashed, approached me with tears streaming down her face. "David, I am so sorry. I thought. Marcus always said, you were just struggling to find your place. I never imagined." "It's all right," I said, though we both knew it wasn't. "You couldn't have known." The crowd began to disperse, guided by the subtle orchestration of the venue staff and my security team, who had materialized from wherever they'd been discreetly positioned throughout the evening. Within minutes, the terrace was nearly empty except for my immediate family and a few close friends who seemed too stunned to move. Judge Harrison approached before leaving, her expression a mixture of professional respect and personal bewilderment. "Harold," she said to my father, "I've worked with your son on 3 separate congressional briefings. He's one of the most capable and respected law enforcement leaders I've ever encountered." She paused, studying Dad's shell-shocked expression. I'm genuinely curious how a family could be so disconnected from something this significant. After she left, we were alone with the wreckage of our relationships. The silence stretched until Marcus finally exploded. 15 years, he shouted, his face flushed with anger and something that looked like betrayal. 15 years! You let us think you were nobody. Do you have any idea how this looks? How embarrassing this is? Embarrassing. The word triggered something in me that had been building for years. "Marcus, I've been protecting you. All of you. Do you think I wanted to sit through dinner after dinner listening to Dad explain to his friends how his eldest son had thrown his life away? Do you think I enjoyed being the family disappointment? But you weren't." Mom's voice was shrill with hysteria. You were, oh God. David, what must people think of us?" There it was. Her primary concern wasn't the years of dismissal or the relationship damage, but how their ignorance would be perceived by their social circle. Dad finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "David, I don't understand." The FBI director reports directly to the president. "You brief Congress, you're confirmed by the Senate. How did we not know?" "Because none of you ever bothered to actually look," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional tornado swirling inside me. "When I was promoted to assistant director, I sent you the press release." "Mom, you said, 'That's nice, dear,' and asked if I'd seen Marcus's article in the Legal Times. When I was appointed deputy director, Dad, you told your golf buddy that I'd gotten some sort of promotion in my little government job." I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my saved emails. "Here's the Senate confirmation hearing notice I forwarded to you. Here's the White House press release announcing my appointment. Here's the Washington Post article about the youngest FBI director in 50 years. I looked up at their stunned faces. "I stopped trying to get your attention because it was clear you'd already decided who I was supposed to be." Marcus ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his wedding composure completely shattered. "But why didn't you just tell us?" Force us to listen. Because I learned something important in those early years when you all made it clear my choices were wrong, I said. I learned that seeking approval from people who've already written you off is a waste of energy, better spent on actually accomplishing something meaningful. The truth of it hit me as I spoke the words. For years, I'd told myself I was protecting them by maintaining the fiction. But really, I'd been protecting myself from their continued dismissal. Isabella sat heavily in one of the reception chairs, her elaborate wedding dress pooling around her like spilled champagne. Marcus, all those times you talked about David being lost, about him not living up to his potential, I thought you were being supportive of a struggling sibling. I had no idea you were talking about one of the most powerful people in Washington. Neither did I, Marcus said quietly, and for the first time, I heard something other than condescension in his voice when he spoke about me. It sounded almost like fear. Mom was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. David, honey, do you really brief the president? Weekly, twice weekly, I corrected. More if there are urgent national security matters. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. And we've been asking you if you're saving enough for retirement. Dad had been silent for several minutes, his lawyer's mind apparently working through the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow. The Morrison corruption case, he said slowly. Senator Morrison, his chief of staff, called me last year, asking if I knew anything about the investigation, if I had any insight into how the FBI was building their case. He looked at me with growing horror. I told him I'd ask you, but that you probably weren't high enough up to know anything useful. The memory of that conversation came flooding back. Dad had indeed asked me about the Morrison case, and I'd given him a carefully vague response about not being able to discuss ongoing investigations. What I hadn't told him was that I'd personally authorized the wiretaps that ultimately brought Morrison down. Senator Morrison is in federal prison, I said quietly. Because of you, Dad said, and it wasn't a question. Because of the evidence his actions generated and the work of dedicated agents and prosecutors. Marcus was staring at his phone, apparently Googling furiously. Jesus Christ, David. There are photos of you, with the president, with the Secretary of Homeland Security. You're in meetings with world leaders. He looked up, his face pale. You're more successful than I am. You're more successful than Dad. Success isn't a competition, Marcus. Isn't it? He shot back. Isn't that what this whole family has been about? Dad grooming me to be the next generation of William's excellence, while everyone assumed you were the cautionary tale? The bitterness in his voice surprised me. I'd always assumed Marcus reveled in his golden child status. But now I was seeing something else. The pressure of being the family's sole source of pride. The weight of carrying everyone's expectations. I never wanted to compete with you, I said. I just wanted to find my own path. And you did, Isabella said softly. You became the FBI director while we all thought you were filing paperwork somewhere. The absurdity of it seemed to hit everyone simultaneously. Here we were, in the ruins of what should have been the perfect wedding reception, my new sister-in-law in a $10,000 dress, learning that the family's biggest disappointment was actually running one of the world's most powerful law enforcement agencies. Mom started laughing. Then, not the careful, social laugh she usually deployed, but something raw and slightly hysterical. We are going to be the talk of Washington for months, she said. The family that didn't know their own son was the FBI director. And despite everything, the years of dismissal, the pain of being written off, the loneliness of carrying secrets I couldn't share, I found myself starting to laugh too. 3 weeks after the wedding, I sat in my corner office at the J. Edgar Hoover building, reviewing intelligence briefings while Washington's autumn rain streaked the bulletproof windows. The stack of missed calls from family members had finally stopped growing, though the voicemails remained largely unanswered. The immediate aftermath of the revelation had been a media circus that my press office handled with practiced efficiency, but the personal wreckage required a different kind of damage control. The Washington Post Society columnist had written a piece titled "The Director They Never Knew," which somehow managed to make our family dysfunction sound charming rather than dysfunctional. Several late-night talk show hosts had made jokes about families who didn't read the news. My assistant had fielded interview requests from every major network, all of which I'd declined. But it was the handwritten letter on my desk that had captured my attention this morning. My father's precise legal script on Williams & Associates letterhead, delivered by courier rather than mail, a formal gesture that somehow made the contents more significant. David, I've been trying to find the right words for 3 weeks. As an attorney, I'm supposed to be skilled with language, but I find myself at a loss when confronting the magnitude of my failure as a father. I've spent the better part of 30 years building a reputation based on seeing the truth in complex situations. Yet I was completely blind to the truth about my own son. Worse than blind, willfully ignorant. I would like to understand, if you're willing to help me try, your father. The intercom buzzed. Director Williams, your 2 o'clock is here. Marcus stood in my doorway looking uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. Gone was the easy confidence, replaced by something that looked almost like nervousness. He'd requested this meeting through official channels, as if he were any other citizen seeking an audience with the FBI director. This is surreal, he said, taking in the office. The flags, the photos with world leaders, the secure communications equipment, the subtle but unmistakable indicators of real power. When we were kids, I used to imagine what my office would look like when I was successful. It looked nothing like this. I gestured to the chairs in front of my desk. Success looks different for everyone. He sat, heavily, his usual polish dimmed. I've been doing some reading since the wedding. About you, about your career. Did you know there are entire academic papers written about your counterterrorism strategies? Foreign policy journals that cite your international cooperation initiatives. I'm aware. There's a case study at Harvard Law about the Morrison investigation. They don't name you specifically because of classification issues, but it's clearly your work. My professors used to assign cases you'd built, and I never knew it. He rubbed his face with both hands. I feel like an idiot. You're not an idiot, Marcus. You just weren't paying attention. That's almost worse. He looked up at me with something I'd never seen from him before. Vulnerability. Do you know what the hardest part is? It's not that you're more successful than I am, though that's a hell of a thing to process. It's that I've been condescending to you for 15 years about not living up to your potential, and the entire time you were saving lives. I leaned back in my chair, studying my younger brother. The Morrison case prevented a terrorist attack on the metro system. The pharmaceutical investigation stopped a price-fixing scheme that was literally killing people who couldn't afford insulin. But you know what? Your work matters too. The clients you've helped, the legal precedents you've set. Impact doesn't have to be measured in headlines. Don't, he said sharply. Don't be generous right now. I don't deserve it. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Isabella asked me a question last week that I can't get out of my head. She asked when was the last time I asked you about your day. Really asked, not just made polite conversation. He turned back to face me. I couldn't remember a single time in the last decade. The admission hung between us like a bridge. Neither of us was sure how to cross. I thought about all the dinners where Marcus had dominated conversations with his latest legal victory while I'd sat quietly, carrying the weight of classified briefings and national security decisions I could never share. There's something else, Marcus continued. I need to tell you something, and it's going to make you hate me even more than you probably already do. I don't hate you, Marcus. You should. He returned to his chair, his hands clenched in his lap. Remember when you sent us that article about your promotion to deputy director? The one Dad dismissed? I remember. I read it. I read the whole thing, including the part about you being the youngest deputy director in bureau history. I Googled your name that night and found dozens of articles about your work, your reputation, your cases. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I knew, David. I knew you weren't just some mid-level agent filing paperwork. The confession hit me like a physical blow. You kn- Not the full extent of it, but I knew you were important. Really important. And I chose not to tell them. The room felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Why? Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. Because I was scared, he said, tears starting to fall. Because my entire identity was built on being the successful William's son. If they knew how successful you really were, where would that leave me? What would my role be in this family? The truth of it settled over me like a weight. My own brother had actively maintained the fiction of my failure to protect his position as the family favorite. It was a betrayal, more profound than simple ignorance. So you let them think I was drifting. I told myself I was protecting you, that you seemed to want privacy about your work. But that was bullshit, and we both know it. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I was protecting myself. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing this revelation. Part of me wanted to throw him out of my office, to cut him off completely. But another part, the part that remembered the little boy who used to follow me around asking to play catch, felt something closer to pity. Isabella knows, he continued. I told her everything after the wedding. She's barely speaking to me. She said she married into a family, not a soap opera, and that I need to figure out how to be a decent human being before she can figure out how to be my wife. Smart woman. Too smart for me, apparently. He looked around the office again. David, I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance you could forgive me? Not today, maybe not next year, but someday. I thought about the 15 years of family dinners where I'd felt invisible, the countless times I'd bitten my tongue while they celebrated Marcus's achievements and dismissed mine. I thought about the loneliness of carrying secrets that could have brought us closer if they'd simply cared enough to ask. But I also thought about the phone call I'd received from Mom the night before, her voice small and broken as she asked if I could help her understand what my job actually entailed. I thought about Dad's letter, sitting on my desk like an olive branch wrapped in decades of regret. I don't know, I said honestly, but I'm willing to try. Marcus nodded, fresh tears starting. That's more than I deserve. Probably. But families are complicated. After he left, I sat alone in my office as the afternoon faded into evening. The weight of secrets I'd carried for so long was lifting, replaced by something more complex but potentially more hopeful. The possibility of relationships built on truth rather than assumption. My secure phone rang. Director Williams, the president would like to see you for tomorrow's briefing an hour early. Something about the Joint Task Force recommendations. Confirmed, I replied, already shifting back into the role that had defined me for so long, the professional mask I'd worn to protect myself from family disappointments. But as I gathered my briefing materials, I realized something had fundamentally changed. The mask no longer felt necessary. For the first time in 15 years, my family knew exactly who I was. Whether they could learn to accept that person remained to be seen, but the burden of pretending to be someone smaller was finally gone. The next morning, I had breakfast with my parents for the first time in 3 years. It was awkward, filled with careful questions and tentative apologies. But when Dad asked about my upcoming congressional testimony on cybersecurity threats, he actually listened to my answer. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, a beginning is enough. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the National Press Club, looking out at an audience that included journalists, law enforcement officials, congressional staffers, and family members. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of operating in shadows and classified briefings, I was giving my first major public address as FBI director to discuss transparency in federal law enforcement. In the front row, Isabella sat beside Marcus, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. Their marriage had survived the revelation, though not without intensive counseling, and what Isabella had described to me as some very difficult conversations about honesty and identity. Marcus had surprised everyone, including himself, by taking a leave of absence from the firm to figure out who he was when he wasn't competing with ghosts. My parents occupied seats in the third row, looking simultaneously proud and bewildered. Dad had thrown himself into understanding my career with the same intensity he brought to complex legal cases, reading everything he could find about bureau operations and counterterrorism strategies. Mom had started introducing me to her friends as my son, the FBI director, with a mixture of pride and amazement that suggested she was still processing the reality. The speech itself was routine, discussing the Bureau's efforts to balance national security with civil liberties, our community outreach programs, and the importance of public trust in law enforcement. But for me, standing there in front of cameras and microphones, it represented something profound. For the first time in my adult life, my professional identity and personal relationships existed in the same space. After the event, we gathered for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Georgetown, the kind of family meal that had once been exercises in endurance, but had gradually transformed into something approaching normal. The conversation still carried undercurrents of adjustment, but the sharp edges of old resentments had begun to smooth. The reporter from the Times asked good questions, Dad said, cutting his osso buco with surgical precision. Your answer about balancing transparency with operational security was particularly well crafted. It was the kind of professional compliment he'd given Marcus hundreds of times over the years, but this was among the first he'd ever directed at my work. The validation felt different now, welcome, but not desperately needed. Speaking of reporters, Isabella said with a mischievous smile, did you see the follow-up piece in the Post-Style section? They called our wedding, the social event that broke Washington's most powerful family wide open. Marcus groaned. We're never gonna live this down. Could be worse, I said. At least they didn't mention the time you threw up on Senator Harrison's shoes at the Christmas party. That was 20 years ago. And yet, somehow, more embarrassing than not knowing your brother runs the FBI. The laughter that followed felt genuine for the first time in years. We were learning to joke about the absurdity of our situation, to find humor in what had once been a source of profound pain. Mom set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I was still getting used to. Maternal pride mixed with something that looked like awe. David. Honey, I have to ask. All those years when we thought you were struggling, were you ever actually struggling? Financially, I mean. Never, I admitted. Senior executive service salary plus the director's stipend, plus security allowances. I've been comfortable for a long time. Then why did you live in that tiny apartment? Drive that old Honda? The question touched on something I'd been thinking about a lot lately. Because I didn't want my lifestyle to become a conversation topic that you'd dismiss as government waste. And honestly, because I'd gotten used to being invisible. It felt safer to stay small. Marcus had been unusually quiet throughout dinner, but now he leaned forward. I've been thinking about that. About staying small. I realized I've been doing the opposite, making myself as big and loud as possible to make sure everyone noticed me. But what if nobody was keeping score? What do you mean? I mean, what if success isn't about being better than someone else? What if it's just about being useful? It was a surprisingly mature insight, from someone who'd spent his adult life collecting achievements like trophies. Isabella squeezed his hand, and I could see why she'd chosen to work through their problems rather than walk away. Being useful, I repeated. I like that. Dad had been listening with the focused attention he usually reserved for closing arguments. David, can I ask you something? During all those years when we were so dismissive, did you ever consider just telling us outright, forcing us to see? The question hung in the air between us. It was one I'd asked myself countless times, especially in the early days when their approval still felt essential to my sense of self-worth. I thought about it, I said carefully. But I realized something important. If I had to force you to respect me, then it wasn't really respect. It was just fear or obligation. I wanted to know that I could build something meaningful even if you never understood it. And you did, Mom said softly. Oh, David, you really did. The conversation drifted to other topics. Isabella's pregnancy, Marcus's sabbatical plans, Dad's consideration of reducing his caseload as he approached retirement. Normal family discussions about normal family concerns. It struck me how exotic this felt after years of careful distance and surface-level interactions. As we waited for dessert, my secure phone buzzed with a message that made me smile. It was from Sarah Martinez, the special agent I'd mentored through her early career, and who now ran the Bureau's community outreach programs. She'd sent a photo from a youth center in Detroit, where she was speaking to at-risk teenagers about careers in law enforcement. "Everything okay?" Isabella asked, noticing my expression. "More than okay." I showed them the photo. "Remember how you asked about being useful?" This agent started as a small-town police officer who everyone said would never make it to the federal level. Now she's inspiring kids who might otherwise never see law enforcement as a path to helping their communities. "You mentored her?" Dad asked. "For 5 years. She's one of dozens of agents whose careers I've helped guide. It's one of the parts of the job that matters most to me." Marcus studied the photo thoughtfully. "You know what's crazy? I've spent 15 years trying to make a partner, make money, and make a name for myself. But I've never mentored anyone. I've never really thought about what I could teach someone else." "It's not too late," I said. "No," he agreed. "I guess it's not." As we left the restaurant, walking together through Georgetown's tree-lined streets, I reflected on how fundamentally everything had changed. The same people, the same family dynamics, but viewed through a completely different lens. My parents were still status-conscious and achievement-oriented, but they were trying to expand their definition of what achievement looked like. Marcus was still competitive, but he was learning to compete with his own potential rather than with others. And me? I was learning to exist fully in both worlds. The classified briefings and family dinners, the national security meetings and wedding receptions, the compartmentalization that had protected me for so long was no longer necessary. 3 days later, I received a call that would test everything we'd rebuilt. A major domestic terrorism plot had been uncovered, requiring immediate congressional briefings and a heightened security posture. The kind of crisis that had previously sent me into professional isolation mode, cutting off personal connections to focus entirely on the threat. Instead, I called my family. Not to share classified details, but to let them know I'd be unreachable for several days, and that they might see concerning headlines. It was a small gesture, but it represented a fundamental shift in how I approached the balance between duty and relationships. Mom's response surprised me. "Be safe, honey. The country needs you. The country needs you." 4 words that acknowledged both the magnitude of my responsibilities and her acceptance of them. It was the validation I'd spent years hoping for, arriving at the moment when I no longer needed it to feel whole. The crisis was resolved after 6 intense days of coordination between multiple agencies, international partners, and congressional leadership. When it was over, when the threat was neutralized and the briefings completed, I went home to my family for Sunday dinner. They didn't ask for details about the case. They understood the boundaries of classified work now. Instead, they asked if I was okay, if I'd eaten enough, if I needed anything. The same questions any family might ask someone returning from a difficult week at work. Sitting around that dinner table, listening to normal conversation about normal things, I realized I'd finally achieved something I'd been unconsciously seeking for years. I was no longer the FBI director who happened to be David Williams, or David Williams who happened to run the FBI. I was simply both, simultaneously and completely. The little boy who'd wanted his parents' approval had grown into a man who understood that the most important approval comes from within. The young man who'd walked away from law school to find his own path had discovered that success isn't about meeting other people's expectations, it's about exceeding your own. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who matter most will eventually see what you've built and understand that it was worth building, even if they couldn't see it at the time. As I looked around that table at my complicated, imperfect, finally honest family, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.